Let's look at the virtue approach to organizational ethics. Now, the main idea in the virtue approach is that acting virtuously, that means living a life characterized by morally good traits and habitual actions, is the key to acting ethically. So that means that if kindness is a virtue, and everybody would agree that kindness is a virtue, acting kind is good, whereas acting unkind is not good. So the idea in the virtue approach is that we look at these morally good traits and habits of actions and base our behavior on what behaviors would fit into these virtues. Now, this is in contrast to following rules or duties, also known as deontology. We saw when we talked about the APA Code of Ethics, that in the codification approach, that there are lists of rules that we need to follow professionally. There's employee handbooks. There's these moral codes that we should follow. The virtue approach is different. It says we should demonstrate these type of traits, being kind and good and gentle and faithful and loving, things like that. This virtue approach is also different than just looking at what the consequences of our actions are. And that's known as utilitarianism. We can say, oh, we should do it if it'll have positive consequences. We shouldn't do it if it'll have negative consequences. Well, that's true, but we don't always know what the consequences are going to be. So the advantage of the virtue approach is that we take these traits that we know from experience, from science, from thousands of years of human experience, that they have positive consequences on people, like being kind and loving and good and generous. And we make our decisions based on these virtues rather than how we think rather than what we simply think the consequences will be. So that's the main idea of the virtue approach. And so the question is, what are virtues? What are the virtues that we're to strive for? So a good definition of virtue is a trait-like strength that leads to morally and socially valued actions. So there's like a strength within us that influences our behavior, that is morally good and socially valued and have generally positive consequences. Now, this definition says a trait-like strength, meaning that a loving person is going to generally be loving. They're kind of like habitual behaviors, but at the same time, it's not a true trait. It's not fixed in an individual. We can make decisions to be more or less loving or kind than we are habitually, so it can vary within an individual. Another characteristic of virtues are that they are really difficult to put into practice continually. It's easy to be loving and kind to someone who's charming and good-looking and loving and kind back to us, but to Mr. Grumpy, it's a little bit more difficult to be loving and kind. And it's easy to be loving and kind when there's no pressure on us and things are going really well. But when there are pressures on us, it's easy to not display those virtues. So that's one of the main insights from the virtue approach, is that people tend not to be very virtuous, especially under certain circumstances. Another characteristic of virtues is their opposites are unethical. For example, let's take the example of kindness, which is considered a virtue. Kind actions are ethical, whether unkind actions are unethical. So if I'm trying to decide how to act ethically, I can ask, would I be being kind or would I be unkind in choosing to do this? So what are these virtues? Let's look at this idea of lists of virtues. it turns out that there are many lists of virtues, and there is no consensus of what are all of the virtues. And part of the reason for this is that virtues tend to overlap. We could say that love covers everything. If we're being loving, we're being virtuous. If we're not being loving, we're not being virtuous. But getting more specific helps us to evaluate things better. So there's many there are many different lists that exist, but one thing that virtues all have in common is that they're independent of our abilities or talents. So we don't say that intelligence is a virtue because that's an ability or talent, or physical coordination is a virtue because that's an ability or a talent. But the another characteristic of all virtues is they have positive life outcomes, and in fact, that's why virtues have become a subject of much study in psychology recently, especially the field of positive psychology. A lot of times, or historically, psychology has looked at clinical psychology. When people are mentally disordered, what's going wrong in them, what the problem is. Positive psychology, on the other hand, says, well, let's look at what goes right in people, and under what circumstances is life the best. And so virtues plays a really big part in that in positive psychology, because virtues are these habitual behaviors that have positive life outcomes. So some of the here's an example of a list of virtues that are commonly studied in positive psychology: wisdom, courage, love, justice, self-control, gratitude. These are all things that psychologists work on measuring, finding out what predicts whether people will act courageously or lovingly or with justice, and also what are the consequences of these. And it's quite encouraging because these virtues all do really have positive life consequences. So that's one example of a list of virtues. Another list of virtues that I'm particularly fond of is the fruit of the Spirit. So this is a Christian list of virtues that's found in the Bible, in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 to 23. But this talks about love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So that means if I'm being loving, I'm being ethical. If I'm acting in an unloving way, I'm not being ethical. If I'm a joyful person at work, that's going to be associated with ethical behavior. If I'm a grumpy person at work, that's going to be associated with unethical behavior. If I bring peace to work, that's going to be a characteristic of ethical behavior. If I'm a source of conflict and anxiety and experiencing those things, that's a characteristic of unethical behavior. If I'm being patient, I'm being ethical. If I'm being impatient with others at work, I'm being unethical. If I've been, same thing with being kind and good and faithful and gentle and demonstrating self-control. If we're demonstrating these things at work, we're going to make ethical decisions and act ethically. And if we don't, we're going to tend to act in unethical ways that have negative life outcomes for us and for the people around us.